Hi everyone, my name is Nadine Matthew, and the topic that I chose for my research presentation is hidden censorship. And instead of the typical censorship we typically may think of, my topic really centers around librarians and the effects of self-censoring behaviors. Just to frame what self-censoring really is and involves, I included some statistics, but essentially what self-censoring is the idea that a librarian may limit himself or herself in terms of what they purchase, how they present things, how they organize things in the library, in order to minimize any controversy or controversial kinds of topics, titles that people may possibly object to. Sometimes they can do this overtly and consciously, but often self-censoring probably does kind of happen below the radar, maybe not even consciously in the librarian's mind. It sort of becomes a way of doing things that opting for the safe route rather than really stringently following ALA recommendations and First Amendment rights and the rights of teens to access information and materials. So just a couple of statistics. In 2009, the School Library Journal did a study that found as many as 70% of school librarians believe they've engaged in self-censorship. And the thing that they cite most in terms of why they would engage in this behavior is concern that parents might find objectionable the things that they have purchased for the library. In this class, we've talked about the fact that teens, like adults, have First Amendment rights, and they don't necessarily leave them at the door of a schoolhouse. And so the American Library Association talks about how institutional self-censorship really can negatively impact the library, its community, and it certainly restricts the access that we want to have available for library users. One library herself talks about the urge to self-censor being as strong as the urge to have to do something extreme when a challenge is put in place. But she mentions that it's kind of a futile sort of attempt to self-censor because, and I'm sure we can all relate to this, we never really know which titles we buy are going to truly spark controversy. Sometimes we fear that a certain title that's edgy or maybe a little bit more racy or has content that probably is more sexual or more mature in nature is going to spark a controversy, but it might not be the actual one that does. The American Library Association also mentions that labeling can be a means of self-censoring if we're trying to restrict access to certain content or trying to make users think about whether that a content is appropriate for them. That could also be a form of self-censoring. What might self-censoring look like? Because some of us might not realize we're doing it. Generally, when you self-censor, certain things are going to happen. You probably will end up with gaps in your collection. You might consider grouping or labeling things or putting them in an area that designates them for a specific group, a specific age. All of those things might actually be self-censoring. Anytime you restrict access to certain things, certain sections or certain materials, that's definitely self-censorship. And of course, sometimes the most subtle form of it is we may actually purchase the items, but because we consider them sensitive, we might not promote them or put them in prominent areas, or maybe the way we promote them kind of lumps them together in a grouping where it might discourage some patrons from identifying with them. Why is self-censoring something to avoid? Well, there's no question that it impacts kids and it impacts the collection, and overall it impacts intellectual freedom and the ability to access information. Generally, what's going to happen is you're going to have, instead of a strong collection that has highly relevant items, you're going to find that a librarian's biases or that of the administration or that sometimes of certain community members are going to start guiding collection development. So if you look at all the verbs here that are in yellow, I mean, essentially those are the negatives that come about when we choose to self-censor. The other thing about self-censoring that a lot of the literature talks about is the fact that it's sort of a slippery slope. Ooh, that was hard to say, slippery slope. Essentially what I mean by that is once you self-censor in your head, even when you think you're applying sort of the idea of the collection policy or selection policy, if you find that you have disincluded or excluded certain things, it's hard then to go on to the next somewhat controversial title and say, okay, I disincluded this, but now I'm going to include this, because we tend to sort of apply or think in terms of precedent. Self-censoring, the most dangerous part of it probably is the fact that it can be very subtle. Studies suggest that some librarians clearly realize they do it, but for every time they realize they do it, they may also engage in items that they don't really necessarily define as self-censorship. A lot of times this is actually rooted in good intention. Most educators, a lot of English teachers, especially those who've had negative experiences with challenges or people wanting to censor materials, tend to get a little gun shy. And so if you are in a school setting where those things have happened, it's easy to start to rationalize that you don't want to run the risk that an item will be challenged. And it's easier probably to err on the side of safety. And that is something we want to discourage and fight against. We want the librarian in a school library, in other library settings, to be the person who stands up for the broadest view of intellectual freedom that we can. So the rationales of I'm trying to protect the integrity of the collection or I'm trying to protect the kids are not necessarily at all good justifications for the practice of self-censoring. Unlike the other forms of self-censorship, maybe the most scary thing is we're the only ones who know we do it. And if we're not self-monitoring, nobody's going to come in and tell us about it. So that is something that we have to be aware of. I have a situation that I'll mention. I'm not trying to make an example of this particular book. It just happens to be the book that I read most recently that has this particular kind of aura about it, and I'm thinking about it in terms of the situation. It's a book called Grasshopper Jungle by Andrew Smith, and it was very well reviewed. It's definitely intended for young adults. The characters in it are young adults, and I bought it, and I really liked the look of the book. I knew I had read the reviews, but I decided to read it because I know some of his other things, while they've been well received, certain kids have kind of wondered about them. So I did read the book, and I did start to question its appropriateness. It was the sort of book that I started reading it and I kind of didn't want to necessarily read more, but then I also couldn't really put it down. It was just such a bizarre book. And the premise of the book includes some very far-fetched things. I mean, essentially society, the whole human race is going to be taken over and destroyed by larger than life-size praying mantises that are just vicious and really determined to procreate. And there is a lot of sex in this book. By the end, the second half of the book, probably the ratio of F-bombs to page is probably 10 per page in some parts. So it has stuff that people could consider objectionable. And I just thought, okay, I don't know about the literary merit of this book. And so I looked again at reviews, and again, they were favorable. I kind of did some digging around. And one of the things I thought I would do is just go to the Goodreads site. Because while it's not a scientific site, it surely will tell me what kids are thinking about the book. And I was sort of shocked to see what I found. Just to summarize, the link is there and you can certainly go to it. But what's interesting is the quality of the commentary that the kids had about this book. Some of them talked about it being artistic. Some of them talked about the fact that they didn't necessarily like it, but they would understand why people might like it. They all almost talked about the creativity of it. They had really interesting observations about the characters and their treatment of one another, because one of the characters is bisexual and is very confused about his sexuality, and many of them pointed out negative treatment of the female character in the book. And the fact that they could discern all of these things and make sense of them made me feel a lot better about having the book available to them. I think sometimes a lot of it has to do with trusting that kids can discern right from wrong. And they certainly did about this book, at least in the comments that I looked at. So it did sort of further my understanding of, aspects of it that I hadn't really considered. If we're trying to avoid self-censoring library practices, you have to be aware that the selection policy is your best friend. You have to kind of stay current and be aware of what collection management involves. Right now, a lot of the self-censoring that might happen in schools is actually happening on the internet. with filters and internet access, so librarians need to be aware of that. We also need to have the up-to-date selection policy handy, be tuned into professional organizations that promote those intellectual freedoms. And I think a big thing we can do is by touching base with other librarians. I think when we operate in isolation, that's when it's really easy to develop tunnel vision and to justify your choices for collection, development, and management in ways that are not as natural as if you were working cohesively with a group. You have to consider how you arrange, display, and shelve, and by all means, you have to be willing to purchase stuff that may be controversial and understand why it has merit and why it's controversial so that you can have those discussions with people who might have concerns. This is my Works Cited page. You can see that a lot of research was done in 2009, right around the time that School Library Journal did their survey of librarians. And then these are just my image citations. It was an interesting topic. Thanks for listening.